Wonderful. Well, we're going to be talking about identifying allies this afternoon with Miss Claudia Allen. Let me tell you, I know Claudia is well known and well respected in the social justice and advocacy community, but let me just share a little bit about her bio. She is a visionary community outreach supervisor for the Howard County Office of Human Rights and Equity. And if there weren't any walls right here, you would see her office down just on the other side of the office park over there. She joined that office in July 2021. Claudia is passionate about how communications, public policy, and faith intersect to affect structural change, create equitable environments, and inspire transformed thinking. In her current role, Claudia has provided servant leadership by making innovative contributions to internal systems, production, various cultural events, and has initiated original programming, training, and webinars. Now, before joining Howard County government, Claudia was a PhD student in the Department of English at the University of Maryland, as well as an online content manager for the esteemed Message magazine. It was her passion for community engagement, social justice, and public policy that pushed her to resign as a professor of English literature and pursue a career in government. And for that, we are very thankful for your passion and your expertise and for sharing it with us this afternoon. I'm going to ask, as I invite Claudia up to the stage, if you could please silence your cell phones or your mobile devices as in respect to the presentation that we're about to hear.
Thanks so much, Melissa. So I am a bit of a mover when I present. This is probably why the government knows that I'm a preacher. And so I am not going to be at this podium. But I definitely want to thank Melissa for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Now, I also recognize I am after lunch. So I recognize probably many of you are dozing off or nodding off. And so I am going to do my best to be as engaging as possible. And I'm going to make this as interactive as possible so that we can have a good time learning together. So we're going to talk about transformational allyship, shrinking the gap between intent and action. All right, shrinking the gap between intent and action. Allyship is defined by the Anti-Oppression Network as an active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and re-evaluating in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group. Allyship is not an identity, but is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups of people. Allyship acts not out of guilt, but rather out of responsibility. And we're going to get into more detail about what this means and what this looks like. But allyship also exists on a spectrum, according to George Lakey. And what he basically shows in his change model is, as you can see here, you have on opposite ends active opposition, and then you also have active allyship. And then you've got passive opposition, neutrality, and then you also have passive allies. And so basically what that means is whether we're talking about any social issue, you are more than likely going to have an individual who is an active ally. This is someone who is, with great intentionality, going above and beyond to advance the cause of this particular issue. That is an active ally. But you also have an active opposer in that same work, meaning that they are intentionally working to ensure that this person or entity or goal or mission does not advance. You have neutrality, people who assume that, hey, if I don't engage at all, if I don't say anything, I can be a neutral party. You also have people who are opposed to a particular idea, particular group of people, but they aren't actually acting against this group. They're just intellectually opposed to them. And then you have passive allies who say, hey, I'm actually for this particular idea, people, group, what have you, but I'm not actively working to support or advance their cause, right? So the first thing I want you to look at is this image. I want you to get it in your mind right there. And then I want you to ask yourself the question, what are the thoughts that come to your mind when you see this particular image? What are the thoughts that come to your mind when you see this particular image? All right? And just go ahead and shout some of those ideas out. Stay in your lane. That's what she sees when she sees this image. What do you see when you look at this image? Okay, wait a minute. So do we have to do the hand raising? I didn't know that. Okay, let me go here. Yes, ma'am. Assistance. Yes, ma'am.
No, he's not helping, but the ladder is broken.
He's not helping her. The ladder is broken. Yes, ma'am.
That's not good.
It's not genuine help. Yes, ma'am.
He's not.
You need my help. Yes, ma'am. Help others as you rise. Did I hear someone on this side? Helping. This looks like helping. Okay. Anybody else? What do you see when you see this image? Say that again. He looks condescending. Okay. That's the highest you can go. Anybody else? So, question. Confused. You didn't see the broken ladder. Okay. Dr. Egg, this is Huck Hemmings. She see the savior complex there. Mercy. So we're going to get into this a little bit more, but what I see actually is an example of transformational allyship. So what I see here is a Black woman who is climbing a broken ladder. And as a Black woman, she does not have a variety of privileges, right? Her Blackness is a burden. Her femininity is a burden. And so that typically is prohibiting her from being able to rise. And yet, on the side, we have a white man who is known as having both the gender and racial privilege necessary to climb. He is standing next to her on the side of the broken ladder, offering his hand to her up. So that what I saw in the image is this white man leveraging his own position, his own power, helping her up a ladder that she otherwise cannot climb without him. So this activity didn't go the way I thought it was going to go. But it still helps me because what I want you all to think about, how are your unconscious biases determining what you see in this picture? Right? This is a predominantly Black congregation or Black space, and everyone saw the image of this white man, and for the most part, no one thought anything positive.
I did.
You said helping. But no one clearly asserted that there's a possibility that this white man is doing some good work other than maybe one or two people. So can we agree that the majority articulated some skepticism, right? So we've got to think about how even as Black people, we carry a lot of unconscious bias. We tend to believe that unconscious bias is only and always being enacted against us, but rarely are we taking into consideration the ways in which our own unconscious bias is causing barriers, all right? Preventing us from even being able to do proper justice work, right? This is particularly important because you want to, and I wasn't going to mention this, but particularly when we think about the civil rights movement and we think about social justice movements in the United States. I know you've got some friends here from the UK. When we think about that, typically it is Black male led. Facts? Yep. And typically, our justice movements do not create space for Black women to be in leadership. We don't even know about the Georgia Gilmores who were selling cakes and pies at churches, raising money, and their money is who bailed out Martin Luther King Jr. out of Birmingham jail. Georgia Gilmore. So at some point, we've got to really kind of think about what are the ways our own biases against gender, our own biases against white people, our own biases against immigrants are preventing us from being able to actually have some really important conversations. There's a gap, Rachel Thomas says, between intent and action. We believe people, by and large, have good intentions and the change is possible, but employees don't know what to do. So typically when we think about allyship, particularly in the workplace, we're talking about allyship from employers, from coworkers, from supervisors. How can individuals actually become sponsors and entities that create space for marginalized groups to assume leadership positions, right? And I think that this absolutely works in the church as well. There is a gap between our intent for allyship, whether that is allyship in the community, whether that is allyship within our local churches, whether that's allyship at the conference level, whether that's allyship at the union level, allyship at the division. There is a gap between what we are intending to do and what we are actually doing. And can we be honest this afternoon that we in our local churches and in our church leadership are not actually doing allyship? So what do you think is causing the gap between a person's intent to be a good ally and actually engaging in allyship that brings about positive transformation? And so remember, allyship is saying that I'm wanting to collaborate with and be a partner in solidarity to bring someone else up out of their own disadvantage. All right? So I'm saying that I recognize that you do not have power. I'm recognizing you don't have privilege. I'm recognizing you don't have opportunity. And I'm saying that I'm willing to come alongside you on a consistent basis to figure out how I can aid in changing your condition or your circumstance. So what are some things that you believe are preventing people from being able to actually act on their desired allyship? Maybe they've got some good intentions, they see that you're unequal, they see the inequities, I desire, wish, and pray better for you, but I'm not actually acting, right? We saw on that spectrum, I'm more so in this passive ally lane. What do you think are some barriers that are causing people to either remain neutral or passive in their allyship? Dr. Hemmings. Either one that you'd like to speak of. Yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. That's great. So just because I can't pass the mic around, I'm going to reiterate what everyone's saying. So what Doc Hemmings just said, I think is really great. She said that our separatism as a denomination is actually prohibiting us at the local church level to build alliances with other churches and other community organizations because we've got so many anti-thoughts. And, you know, you're the antichrist, you're mark of the beast, you got 666 anywhere, you know, variety of reasons why we tend to not want to partner with, and ultimately why we oftentimes work in silos, right? Like we'll come up with a new soup kitchen, we'll come up with a new pop-up pantry, we'll come up with a new clothing giveaway as though Goodwill is not up the street and the Howard County Food Bank isn't around the corner, right? So even though there are entities that already exist, we, rather than partner with existing entities, have a tendency to only want to operate in isolation, right? I saw a hand back here. Yes, ma'am?
And it's recording. And so, also, there we don't know how we are. Well, what's the limit about home? You don't have the next. You know,
Gotcha. So you're saying our own lack of inauthenticity is also preventing us from allyship. Yes, sir. And then I'm coming to Melissa. No, this gentleman behind you. Yes, sir.
You know what, Larry, by Marty, our world, or everybody else, here's the one that I can never make it all like that stuff on freezing bubble. But definitely up of the big area is actually that is sometimes we're unconscious, but saying it the way you say it, you know.
That's great. Yeah, we're going to get into that because I really do believe that our own unconscious biases are preventing us. So that's great. Absolutely. Melissa.
yeah. So we're talking about relationship. What is a barrier? One of the biggest barriers to relationship fear.
Mm.
The appropriate pointing Jeff possible.
That's so great. So what she said is that when we're talking about allyship, we're talking about relationship building. And relationship building barriers are fear. Absolutely. Sir, did you have your hand?
Also bias.
Mm-hmm.
I want to eat rice and beans, you know, he said that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, guilty messy, Maryland messy.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of culture bias that I have seen.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that, sir, because I think oftentimes as Black people, we are very comfortable having dialogue about the ways in which there is bias and discrimination between Black and white, but we are rarely willing to have honest conversations about the frustrations, the barriers, the discrimination that we're perpetuating against one another, depending on if you are from the Caribbean, if you are from the continent of Africa, if you are Black American, if you are Afro-Latina and from South America, right? So we've got our own internal fissures even within Black communities that we are also not dealing with, and our allyship is also not leaning in those directions either. So because I feel a way about the fact that every single time somebody Haitian wants to talk about they got their freedom first, I'm upset, I feel a way, it's rice and peas, not rice and beans, that we keep coming up with ways to differentiate ourselves rather than find common ground. I feel like I saw a hand here. Yes, ma'am. How will I be perceived?
When I see I want to help, I'm not but don't what you know what you can do. You always you the same
Mm-hmm.
You know, why?
That's really great. I appreciate that. What she shared is that we've got our own suspicions and we have our own perceptions of what people are intending when they do good or seek to do good, right? And I think we even saw that in the first activity, right? We see this example potentially of a white man helping a black woman, but the perception is, well, there has to be an angle. He can't really want to do her good. The man had no face. The artist drew no face, and yet somebody was like, he's looking at her with condescension, right? So it's like, how are our perceptions, right, kind of going into what we think?
They had, it looked like,
Yeah. I appreciate the analysis that Doc Hemmings is making of the painting of the hand, right? And I totally think that there's space, for that interpretation. But I also think that, like, you are bringing that into, right? Like, that's an external reading that you're adding. So let's just talk a little bit about some statistics really quickly, just so that we can show what it really means, the difference between intent and action, or that gap. I definitely want to show that. So white employees in 2021, 63% of white employees saw themselves as allies specifically to women of color, okay? Now, women of color, 16% of Latino women said that they think their employees are allies to them at work. 11% of Black women said that they think that their employees are allies to them at work. That is a massive gap, right? 2020, 63% of white. 2021, 77%. So we remember COVID, right? So a lot happened in 2020. Over 2020 into 21, we've got more white people reading books now, right? So white, as though they didn't read before. But white people are reading White Fragility. They're reading books like Stamped from the Beginning. They're trying to do their best to be educated, and they're coming back to the workplace saying, hey, I am an ally. So here are some specific ways that allyship should show up, right? If you are an ally, that means that you are educating yourselves about the experiences of women of color. Only 45% of white employees that articulated that they were allies educated themselves on the experiences of women of color. 43% publicly gave women credit for their ideas. So again, 77% of white people said that they were allies to women of color, but only 43% of them were willing to give public credit to their ideas. Like, let that sink in. I'm sure we've been in plenty of board meetings, all right? Not to put the pastors out there, but I know I've been in plenty of board meetings where there's a woman that has a really great idea. She says the idea, silence, or nothing, right? And then all of a sudden, somebody's male elder comes and repeats the exact same thing she said, and all of a sudden, it's brilliant. So like, oh my goodness, I don't know why we didn't even think of that, elder so-and-so. We absolutely should have done that. Sister so-and-so said that 5 minutes ago, right? So women are experiencing this constantly, right? Again, 39% said that they work to confront discrimination when they see it. Okay, so allyship means if I see discrimination, I'm going to intentionally and very vocally oppose that. Only 39% of white employees are actually confronting discrimination. Okay. 21% advocate for new opportunities for women of color. So again, as you can see on this chart, the contribution of allyship is getting heavier, right? Do you notice that? right? So we begin with the easy step of all you got to do is educate yourself. Now we're moving along on the graph. We're getting a little harder. Now you're needing to actually use some of your own privilege and power to advocate for a woman of color to get a new opportunity. Of the 77% of white employees who call themselves allies, only 21% of them are actively advocating for new opportunities. And finally, this is probably the most important one, 10% are mentoring women of color. 10%. And ultimately, any kind of leadership ascension, any kind of new opportunities for any kind of a marginalized or disproportionately disadvantaged group requires mentorship. Because more than likely, this individual and persons like this individual have never been in this role before. So if they've never been in the role before, how are they supposed to do the role? So you can find a great woman, you can find a great young person, you can find a great, anyone, and say, hey, I want you to be in this position. So-and-so, you are a 25-year-old woman at my local church. I want you. I see that there's a spiritual anointing on you. I want you to be my first elder at my church, right? Beautiful. Love that. Here for it. That 25-year-old woman has no idea what it means to be the first elder of a church. It's very possible she doesn't even have a first elder in her family. Very possible that she has no idea a church manual even exists, where there are breakdowns of the roles and responsibilities of church leadership. So when we then appoint a 25-year-old to be the first elder, and the 25-year-old has no idea how to run board meeting in the absence of a pastor, and they begin to make a variety of mistakes and errors, what we instead do is remove the 25-year-old woman from being head elder. Rather than saying, okay, let me actually sit down with you and talk with you and mentor you, maybe actually partner you with the first elder so that you're learning from that first elder, and then maybe over a year, year and a half, 2 years after shadowing this individual, then you assume the position because you've been in ongoing mentorship for 2 years. But I've intentionally said, I really want a young person in this role. And so because I want a young person in this role, I'm taking the allyship steps necessary to both equip them and put them in the position. Does that make sense? So one of the reasons that I think we are struggling to participate and engage in real allyship is because of unconscious bias, which is what we kind of got into a little bit there. And so we're going to spend some time there because I think that we have a variety of assumptions that we are operating with at the local church level, okay? So let's just be honest here. Unconscious bias is a preference for or against a thing, person, or group compared with another. Biases may be held by an individual, a group, or an institution, and we're sometimes conscious of these biases and can state them directly. So the latter sentence is talking about conscious bias. Conscious bias means I am aware of the thoughts that I think towards you. Unconscious bias means I am unaware of the thoughts that I think towards you. Now, we typically talk about this, or I typically teach this in conjunction with white against black. But I want to do laity against pastor. Nah, they see it. Right? Now, for the laity in the room, this is not a self-indictment. I want you to yell out what some of the biases are that you have heard about pastors. Obviously, you do not hold these biases. They are just things you've heard in conversation that other people have articulated, but the Spirit would never, ever allow you to utter such words. So What are some biases that you have heard about pastors? Just shout a couple out. Micromanaging. Yes, sir. Too intellectual. What's another one? Prideful.
My way or the high.
My way or the highway. What else? Say?
Full of
Full of self. My God. What else? Lazy. What else? Dictatorship. This is good. This is good. So what this means, right? If these are your conscious biases, because that's what you could articulate off of the top of your mind when I ask you, pastor and bias. Those are your conscious biases against a pastor. That means that when a pastor comes to your church, your immediate thought about that individual is that they are too intellectual, they are prideful, they are self-centered, they are micromanaging, they are dictators. How do you do any kind of work when that is at the core of your thinking about an individual you haven't even met? So I see the pastors in the room. What are some of the biases you've heard? Of course, you would never articulate this about the laity. What are some biases you have heard about the laity? Just go ahead and shout a couple out. We ain't heard nothing. Elder Josiah has heard nothing. Nothing. What are some biases? Even the laity, what are some biases you've heard about yourself? Yes. Too much like sheep. Okay. What else? I see a hand in the back. Not faithful, my Lord. Anything else? On the intellectual. Anti-intellectual. Okay. They think they know everything. What? Uncooperative. This is good. Anything else? What's some biases against the laity? Dear sweet that book. Anything else? Troublemakers. Okay. Anything else? Anything else? Sorry, what did you say? So, if these are our unconscious biases about, conscious and unconscious biases about the laity, right? So that means that we've got a bunch of lay people who believe that their pastor is prideful, arrogant, micromanaging, a dictator, while that pastor simultaneously believing that their layperson is unfaithful, anti-intellectual, right? So that means that we are coming into space together skeptical about one another. We fundamentally do not trust one another. How does a pastor engage in allyship with its members, provide empowerment, mentorship to those members if the pastor unconsciously believes that the member is unfaithful, uninterested, disrespectful, troublemaker? As a pastor, you cannot provide any kind of mentorship or allyship to an individual if that's what you think of them. As a layperson, how am I supposed to enact allyship with my pastor? Oh, that's when it got quiet, Doc. It's like, I'm supposed to provide allyship to the pastor? Yeah. Remember, like Melissa said, we're talking about relational exchange when we talk about allyship, and that relational exchange is for the purpose of mission. It's because I'm trying to build community, I'm trying to build solidarity, I'm trying to advance a cause, and I actually cannot do that if I think this way about you. Ma'am, in the back, I see you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Absolutely. And we're going to get into what actual unconscious bias is, how it shows up. But if I'm honest with you, I have traveled across the North American division preaching on social justice. I have preached to a variety of churches. I have done workshops. I have worked with pastors. I've worked with laity. I've worked with young people. I've worked with old people. And you would be shocked that the laity say, I want to do social justice, but my pastor won't let me. And the pastor says, I want to do social justice, but the laity won't let me. The young people say, I want to do social justice, but the old people won't let me. And the old people say, we want to do social justice, but the young people don't want to. So how is it that everybody wants to do the same thing, yet everybody thinks no one wants to do what they want to do? At some point, right, we are making assumptions about each other that are not actually based on conversations or interactions that we have actually had. So when we think about unconscious bias, I want to recommend a book to you. It's called Blind Spot. In this book, you learn that it is possible to have what's called cultural blind spots in the eye. I wish I can't do this with you now, but the book has an activity in there that is going to show you that you possess what's called the retinal scotoma. The retinal scotoma is a blind spot in your physical eye. And what these scientists suggest is that in the same way that you have a physical blind spot that you more than likely did not know about, you also possess cultural biases that you also are not aware of. Now, where bias becomes a problem is that once lodged in our minds, hidden biases can influence our behavior toward members of particular groups, but we remain oblivious to their influence. So what does that mean? That means that I have an assumption in my mind that my pastor is micromanaging. So even though the pastor just got installed last week and I have never met or talked to him or her, when that individual sends me an email and says, hey, so I'm going to pick on Dr. Shakes because she goes to my church. I'll say, hey, Dr. Shakes, can you send me the names of the baptismal candidates for next week? If Dr. Shakes has internalized that pastors are micromanaging, she's going to immediately have a jerk reaction, like, why do I need to send you the list of the names to the baptismal candidates? I'll send it to you next, when it's time. These interactions happen all the time. I don't know why you're looking at me like I'm crazy. All this man asked for was for the names. But we're reacting based on unconscious bias, right? Now, unconscious bias or implicit bias is not a new way of calling someone a racist. More importantly, when we think about unconscious bias, what's important for you to know is that the brain is a malleable organ. How many in here have heard of the term neuroplasticity? Love it, love it. What that basically means is it is possible for you to retrain the brain to think differently because the brain is not a hardwired machine. So unconscious bias comes as a result of a myriad of messages, right? So like this woman in the back was sharing, if I get social messages, if I get messaging from my parents and how I'm being raised, if I get messages that are theological in nature from sermons, if I get messages from media, news outlets, these kinds of entities, all that information comes together and it ultimately gives me knowledge on a particular group or individual. Now, what's important for you to know is the brain is trying to operate as efficiently and effectively as possible. So the brain is trying to help you make quick decisions so that it is not taking long to deliberate over things. That's for your own safety and survival. This is why the brain naturally categorizes information, which is what a bias is. A bias is the brain naturally categorizing information so that you can make a quick, efficient, and easy decision. So that bias, I want to be clear, is not in and of itself evil. Bias is a natural part of the human existence. It is impossible for you to be human, for you to be alive, and then for you to not have bias. All right? So that means that if I possess bias simply based on the architecture of the brain and also based on the experiences that I've had, ways I've lived, where I've lived, how much money I've made or not made, all of these things are impacting how I see other people. All right? So what this means is I have to be intentional about recognizing how my experiences as a millennial young Black girl that grew up in Southwest Michigan, rural country, impacts how I may have biases about you, in some words, city slickers. That's a fact. There's no way for me to come from Michigan and not have biases about people from DC. Right? So it's the same thing when we're talking about this. Dee's from the UK. I was talking to her last night. I saw this interview. I think it was Jimmy Fallon had the actor who plays Vision in Marvel, and he's an actor from the UK, so he has a very strong British accent. Jimmy Fallon is talking to this actor like, oh my goodness, you're probably brilliant. You love to read and you've got all this knowledge and information and blah, blah, blah. And this actor literally says, I barely finished high school. I hate reading. And he articulated that in the strongest British accent of all time. Why is that interesting? Most Americans, particularly white Americans, have the unconscious bias that English people are smarter than American. Shout out to Dee. That's a fact. It is purely based on the accent. And in the same way that we assume that a British person is brilliant, we also assume that individuals from the deep South are ignorant. Right? 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 So the assumptions, we got to think about the ways that our conscious and unconscious bias shows up even in situations outside of race. Here's another good example for you. When you go to work and you walk past somebody with a dirty desk, what's the first thought that comes to your mind? Say that again. Disorganized. They keep their home that way. Dirty home. What else? Busy. Say it. Anxious. Lazy. Okay. What if possibly they're just creative? What if maybe they're just not tidy? What maybe the house is clean because they have a partner who maybe is more of a neat freak. The house might be clean, but I mean, if you keep giving me all these projects every day, then that's going to keep looking like this, right? But again, right? Once again, unconscious biases that are not attached to race, they're attached to everyday situations. I know for myself, if I came up here, I ironed this skirt this morning. It's pleated. However, there were wrinkles in the skirt in the morning. I very well could have put the skirt on the way it was. But my own unconscious bias about y'all's unconscious bias is that if I get up here in wrinkled clothes, you are going to assume that I am unkempt, I am unprofessional, I don't know what I'm doing, right? And I could say everything I'm saying just as well as I'm saying it, but there are a couple of you in here who would look at the wrinkles in this skirt for the totality of this presentation. Right? Unconscious bias, once again, preventing us from being able to build allyship. To be human is to have bias. Bias is a natural part of the human condition that shows up in our decisions, our reactions, and our interactions with one another. What we've got to be careful of is that we're not allowing our biases to prevent us from partnership. We've got to ensure that our biases are not preventing us from mentorship, from succession, from actually having effective ministries, because we have biases against our elders and biases against the youth and biases against the young adults. And so because of those biases, when we engage in one another, if some people haven't seen a young adult in 3 weeks, the first thing you say to that young adult when they come into your church is, "Where have you been?" Your unconscious bias is assuming that because this person is a young adult and that you have not seen them for 3 weeks, that they haven't been in church. The assumption that they have not been in church is that they have not been spending time with God. So I'm going to give them a reprimand rather than a welcome. Unconscious bias. Now, unconscious bias leads also to microaggressions. I'm going to try to move past through this very quickly so we can get some questions. But microaggressions is a term that was coined by Dr. Chester Pierce in 1974, specifically to talk about the subtle interactions that Black people were having with white people. But since then, it has evolved to encompass significantly more than just racial microaggressions. So there are 3 types of microaggressions that I want to make you aware of very quickly. There is something called a micro assault. There is a micro insult, and there is what is called a micro invalidation. Okay? Micro assault, micro insult, and a micro invalidation. A micro assault is an explicit racial derogation characterized primarily by a verbal or nonverbal attack. This is calling someone the N-word. This is calling an Asian person Oriental. This is when I went to Australia and did a presentation. One of the white men stood up and called me a colored girl and said I was bringing racism to Australia. That's a micro assault, right? Don't worry, I wasn't offended. It's a compliment. Micro assault. Micro insult is characterized by communication that is rude or insensitive. So a micro insult is an example of this. I have one of my outreach coordinators at work is Muslim, but they are what's called a Muslim revert. So in Islam, if you are Christian and you, as we would say in Christianity, convert to Islam, then that term of you going from Christian to Muslim is called revert. So she is a Muslim revert, which means that there are people that knew her when she was a Christian, and there are people who know her now and she's a practicing Muslim. She wears the hijab at work, and we were fully at an event where a woman of color came up to her and said, "Oh my gosh, like, when are you going to stop wearing this?" That is a micro insult, right? Rooted in the bias that clearly this is a phase and that her Muslim faith is not real and that at some point she's going to come back to a reality, stop wearing the hijab, and become a Christian again. That's a micro insult. I see your hand. Perfect. Absolutely. Micro insult. You are so intelligent. I get it all the time. Typically, when I finish these, somebody white is going to come up to me and be like, you are so articulate. Articulate. That was amazing. What? And they're really, again, intent versus action. The intent is to compliment. It is to say, wow, you are very articulate. The action is an insult because it suggests that I shocked him as though I was not supposed to be articulate. Right? Yes, sir. Perfect. Thank you so much for that question. So the reason it is called a micro assault is because an assault is physical battery. So when we're talking about a verbal exchange, that's why scholars have given it the micro term. But I really appreciate the distinction here because obviously if you call someone the N-word, nothing about that experience is micro. Same thing with displaying a swastika. The displaying of a swastika, sociologists and scholars would put in the category of a micro assault. However, no Jew is going to internalize the visualization of a swastika as a micro anything, right? So again, these are terms from scholarly journals. They do not denote the actual harm or the ramifications of this kind of behavior. The final term I want to introduce to you is called a micro-invalidation, and this is where it's going to get good. A micro-invalidation is characterized by communication that excludes, negates, or nullifies the psychological thought, feelings, or experiential reality of a person. I am not going to deal with the racial aspect here because I think we've talked enough about race. A great example of a micro-invalidation that I would like this group to just kind of breathe deeply and wrestle with is your refusal to use a person's preferred pronouns. I know. Breathe deeply. Deeply, slowly. Okay? Micro-invalidation is communication that excludes, negates, or nullifies the psychological thought and feelings of another person. If they think they are a they, and they have asked you to refer to them as they, you should show a sign of respect and honor their humanity and the divine choice that even Jesus Christ gives them and refer to them as they. That is not suggesting that you agree. This is not a removal of your own theology. It is simply an opportunity for you to honor someone else's humanity. That's it. See your hand. Yes, sir.
For a living, I do biosocial assessments.
Mm-hmm.
And as part of those assessments, usually they ask my pronouns, sexuality, and things like that. I don't get it often, but there are some people, when you ask them what your pronouns are, they act like you insulted them personally.
Mm-hmm.
And they just react in the way that says, well, can't you see me? Or I'm a guy, or I'm a girl, and why are you asking that? So that would definitely be the micro-validation. I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So just really quickly, by show of hands, based on what we just described, based on these definitions I gave, anybody in this room, have you ever experienced a micro assault, a micro insult, or a micro invalidation? I got a woman in the back shaking her head, waving her hand. I mean, she is just deep in the spirit on this question. Raise your hand if you experienced that. No. I need you to hold it up. 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 So when you look around, what I want you to see, sorry, Melissa, you're the only white woman in the room. A white woman raise her hand. Women raise their hands. Men raise their hands. I have to say this for the women. Because oftentimes we assume that men do not experience microaggressions. Yeah. Okay? So let's not always think as women that men, black men, white men, do not experience this kind of stuff as well. I got all kinds of stories of white men who have experienced microaggression, right? All of us experience microaggressions because all of us have unconscious and conscious bias. And that bias is causing harm. And the microaggression is the harm. So that when we have this picture, this was great. I didn't know this picture was going to do me so much good. All right? When we have this picture, it is our microaggressions, or rather, I'll say it like this. It's our unconscious bias that causes us to, let's say, we erase that gentleman altogether. And because of his unconscious bias, he's no longer even interested in helping her up the ladder. And now that you've got this black woman trying to climb a ladder that's broken. And if we're honest, the majority of us in our churches, in our families, in schools, where we work, we are constantly confronted with individuals that are trying to climb ladders that are broken. And we have an opportunity to come and stand behind them and offer them the hand on the broken side so that they can get to where they need to go. And yet, because of our unconscious bias, we are unwilling to provide that kind of allyship. Unwilling to participate in any capacity. And instead of doing good, we do harm. By show of hands, has anyone in here ever needed an ally? Everybody in here has been in need of an ally, okay? So Dr. King said, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And the fact of the matter is, if we just take the black and the white and put it to the side, and we say we need to deal with food insecurity in our communities, we need to deal with diabetes in our communities, we need to deal with mass incarceration in our communities, we need to deal with teen pregnancies in our communities, we need to deal with the fact that certain young people are not graduating from high school, we need to deal with the fact that there are certain communities who are immigrants who do not have access to the proper resources and care because they don't speak English. Whatever the need is, many of us are passive and unwilling to engage in the problem. We do not outright reject people who need our help. Instead, we say, I don't need to help. And you will get whatever is due you in this this imagined allotted period of time. But I do not need to participate. Particularly, I don't need to participate if I theologically disagree with you. I particularly don't need to participate if I don't actually agree with women being in leadership. Particularly don't need to participate if there's some kind of dividing line between you and me. Off the top of your head, who are people that you think need, or groups of people, obviously don't name a person, right? Sorry, I realize that question might not be clear, right? Who are types of people that need allyship from us? Women, young Black men, homeless, disabled, immigrants. Who else? White men. You know, they're being attacked right now. Yeah. Yes.
I must confess, my name is Uwe Shakes. My children have lives.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that I live in a predominantly white community.
Mm-hmm.
And I shot myself
Mm-hmm.
taking a walk about 3 miles in the community. You don't have to go trail or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Walk in the community.
Yeah.
And I saw a young Black man
Mm-hmm.
for the first time
Yeah.
walking towards me.
Mm-hmm.
And my first thought, shock of all shock, what is he doing in my community?
Yeah.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
The first thought that entered my pure, unbiased mind, because I thought I was okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I seriously thought I was okay.
Mm-hmm.
I was shocked. And then I'm trying to erase the thought real quick.
Right.
I'm looking at him, I'm thinking, and I even waved to him.
Yeah.
So what you're talking about?
Yeah.
American woman
Yeah.
would look at him
Mm-hmm.
and wonder what is he doing in my community.
That's it.
I live there, but it's
Yeah.
not my space.
Right.
It's not my world.
Yeah.
It wasn't okay. I'm okay now.
Yeah.
After I worked through the bias.
Right.
But if we examine ourselves seriously,
Exactly.
all of us sitting here right this second,
Absolutely.
we have a bias.
Absolutely.
Serve somebody.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
effectively.
Absolutely.
So that bias has been erased.
Thank you so much for sharing that and being so vulnerable, Dr. Shakes. I think we needed that personal touch and example to really wrestle with this. So I bring this chart back to you. This is the spectrum of allyship. When I say women's ordination, this is not a respond time. I want you to reflect, where do you fall on that spectrum of allyship? If I say food insecurity, where do you fall on that spectrum of allyship? If I say education for immigrant kids, education for low-income kids, education for kids whose parents are teenagers, where do you fall on that spectrum of allyship? Where do you fall on the spectrum of allyship when it comes to community partnership with, let's say, quote unquote, Sunday churches? Where do you fall on that spectrum of allyship? At some point, the beauty of this diagram is that you can begin in active opposition, but allyship is a moving, lifelong process. So that even if you begin in active opposition, it doesn't mean you have to stay there. You can move into active allyship. You can move into becoming a person who is no longer actively opposing a thing, but is actively sponsoring, is actively engaged. Now, like they said, my job is around the corner. So I get to do these presentations, but I don't get to do the Jesus. So Jesus was an ally, right? John 8, verses 2 through 11, the Bible says, and I'm reading from the Christian Standard Version, at dawn, he went to the temple again, and all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, making her stand in the center. Teacher, they said to him, this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say? They asked this to trap him, in order that they might have evidence to accuse him. Jesus stooped down and started writing on the ground with his finger. When they persisted in questioning him, he stood up and said to them, the one without sin among you should be the first to throw a stone at her. Then he stooped down again and continued writing on the ground. When they heard this, they left one by one, starting with the older men. Only he was left with the woman in the center. When Jesus stood up, he said to her, woman, where are they? Has no one accused you? No one, Lord, she said. Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, do not sin anymore. As a church, local churches and disciples of Jesus Christ, we are called to allyship. In the person of Jesus, we see that allyship is demonstrated as covering and not condemnation. And oftentimes, as churches and as church people, church leaders, church members, we are far more concerned with condemning than we are covering. We are incapable of allyship because we are more concerned with condemning than covering. And if we would instead change our mindsets from, but that I had to make you aware of your sin, Melissa. If I don't make you aware of your sin, I'm not doing good allyship if I don't make you aware of your sin. At what point do we tangibly believe in the Holy Spirit? Because if we tangibly believe in the work of the Holy Spirit, then the Holy Spirit would be doing the convicting and the converting, and we would be doing the allyship. We would be doing the relationship. We would be doing the, how can I connect you to Jesus? How can I connect you to community? How can I ensure that you're experiencing belonging? How can I ensure that your basic needs are always being met? That's our job. The beauty about Christ is that in the same way that we are serving as allies and advocates, he's serving as an ally and an advocate. And he's literally in heavenly places. We believe as Adventists, right? He's in heavenly places, literally mediating on my behalf. Literally serving as my ally unto God, saying, Lord, Father, she is wicked in all of her ways, but my blood. If Jesus is performing allyship like that for my spiritual soul? Why can I not focus on the allyship that is necessary for people's physical, social, emotional, mental, financial life? Why am I concerning myself with their sins, something that I cannot atone for, something I cannot cleanse them of, something I cannot forgive them for, something that Jesus has already said he's dealing with? If you just bring me the person, I'll deal with the sin. And Jesus is saying to us, you bring me the person, I'll deal with the sin. Can you deal with the hunger? Can you deal with the domestic violence? Can you deal with poverty? That's what Jesus is asking us to do.
Right.
The allyship.
Yeah.
10 steps, and I'm quitting so you guys can ask a question. 10 steps to become an ally. First, become educated. You've got to learn and you've got to unlearn. There are some things that we have been taught, particularly as Adventists, that are inhibiting our ability to do this work. You've got to learn and you've got to unlearn. The second thing, you've got to resist assuming what one person needs might look different from another person. So even if you see someone, like Dr. Sheikh said, a really great example, I could see a young Black man in a particular neighborhood with a particular getup. He might actually drive a Benz in comparison to my Mazda. I'm assuming that he has a particular financial need based on how he looks when he is potentially in a better financial position than me. Let's not make assumptions based on what we see. 3, we need to build relationships. Allyship is all about relationship building. It cannot be circumvented. We talked about this a little bit last night. It cannot be scaled. This is something that happens over time with intentionality. 4, don't restrict people. Human beings are multifaceted, and each one of us has distinct experiences that make us who we are. If I'm going to be an ally, then I have to be willing to see the fullness, the full complexity of an individual person's humanity. And oftentimes, Black people are not given this, right? Black people are often seen as a community, and white people are often given the gift of individualism. That is a part of white privilege, individuality, right? So that if a white person robs a bank, then Tom robbed the bank because Tom is having a bad day. If I rob the bank, then Black women are on a trend upward into robbing banks. And now we need to study sociologically what is causing Black women to rob banks, right? 5, empower people. We talked a little bit about this with the image, but oftentimes we are engaging in a kind of ally. We're not actually engaging in allyship. We're engaging in charity. And we're willing to give people what they need in a temporary setting, but we are unwilling to actually partner with them to empower them for their own long-term success. How can we actually empower people and not just simply continue to give them in exchange transactionally what their temporary need might be? 6, don't be afraid. We're so scared of the people that don't like us. We feel like we don't know what we're going to talk to them about. I don't know how to start a conversation. I don't know where we're going to begin. We have far more in common with these people than you think. Number 7, become a sponsor. So particularly in the workplace, becoming a sponsor means that you are actually putting your own livelihood, your own reputation, your own risk on the line and being an ally. And so we saw this actually after 2015 out in Denmark and Finland. The male pastors there all returned their ordination certificates because they wanted the women to be able to be ordained, right? So that's being a sponsor. That's saying I'm putting something on the line to apply the necessary privilege pressure so that the powers that be can actually enact the change that I believe is necessary, right? 8, become a voice. We're oftentimes seeing, experiencing things in real time, and we're allowing it to pass us by. We're hearing people make inappropriate comments in meetings. We are hearing people make inappropriate statements at church. And rather than addressing it, we pretend it didn't happen. Being an ally is saying, I am going to respond. I'm going to confront. I'm going to say this kind of language, this kind of statement, this kind of behavior is unacceptable. And finally, become a listener. Allyship is more about listening than speaking. You cannot be a good ally without first sitting and listening for a very long time, because in order to be an ally, you have to know what the other person needs. And that means that you have to listen to understand and not listen to respond. Listen long enough to hear what a person is saying their need is, rather than assuming that you know what that need is, and even assuming that you have the answer. We as a church, as a local church, as a denomination, genuinely might not have the answer. We might not have the resources. We might not have the personnel. It's completely outside of our purview to even deal with this issue. So if I'm listening and I'm hearing, then that means that my allyship is going to look like me connecting you to the person that you actually need to be connected to, that isn't me. White people are the only people with savior complexes. Black people have savior complexes too. Black people have a God complex too. And we oftentimes think that we can be the solver and the answer of all things. And we cannot. I really appreciate Edward Woods III giving me the opportunity to present to you all on allyship. It has been a pleasure. I hope that this has been substantive and informing and enlightening for you. And I know that, we started a little late, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Use my voice.
There you go, Doc.
You hear me now? Being a Southern gentleman, I preach.
It's on.
It's on?
Yeah, go ahead, Doc.
Oh, okay. Being a Southern gentleman, I resonate with your presentation, and I appreciate it. There's a difference between, how do you articulate the difference between being biased, prejudice, if you would call, and race? Because I believe there is a difference. All of us have bias.
Yeah.
And we need to be aware of what ours are as we know them.
Yeah.
But also open to others sharing with us their perspective of certain biases we might have that we're not aware of. You have anything you would like to?
Yeah, absolutely. So great question. So a bias is a conscious or unconscious thought, a prejudice that you have towards someone. It might not be restricted to race. So it could be based on a behavior or a variety of other things. To be a racist is to be someone who very specifically has an issue or some kind of a prejudice towards someone based on their race. But I think what's also an important part of the definition of racism is that it is attached to systems. So you are using systems of power to ensure that a person does not get certain resources, opportunities, or access. So the bias is saying, hey, I think these thoughts about Black women. Racism is saying, I am now going to establish a variety of policies that ensure that Black women do not assume certain positions. So what that looks like is oftentimes nepotism. So if there's a company that always hires their associates from Yale or from Harvard or from predominantly white institutions, then you are pulling from a smaller pool of Black female candidates. So that kind of being an active ally to reverse that kind of racism would mean this company is now going to do an initiative where for the next 2 to 3 years, we hire our associates from Spelman College. So it's saying, okay, we recognize the disparity. We recognize that this is systemic. And so we're going to institute a systemic answer to what is a systemic problem. Dr. Shakes. Question.
Real quick, because I told you something negative about me. So now you hear something positive. But anyway, back to the racism. Systemic racism is something that, unfortunate, I've experienced too many times. When we look at the young Black male, their sorrow, I volunteered way back my former life in one of the elementary schools in this, I'll just say this district. Nobody knew my background. I didn't share anything with the teachers. I just volunteered to be a part of the class, first grade. And what I saw really explains why young Black men, unfortunately, are where they are today. I saw a young Black male who could handle English, they could handle math, they were doing very well. And because of their color, they're moving them beyond first grade into second grade. They're not moving them in the honors section, automatic, like the others. They're moving them into that other section, systemic racism. So I'm sitting there with them not understanding who I am and that I understand what they're doing until I had a chance to confront the principal and to show him the work that I worked with the kids. I knew their ability and I was able to show the evidence that you cannot, under any circumstances, I didn't even understand systemic racism at that time. You cannot move them into this section. But see, I was only one person in one school in the entire county trying to change what I didn't even understand until later on. So that's what we're talking about. The bias was the gentleman in the community that I thought didn't belong. The systemic racism is that. It was systemic. By the time they got to middle school, they were out on the street. They were bored, etc. You know the rest of the story. But you know it hasn't stopped. You know, and we, each of us, has a responsibility wherever we are. Still, it doesn't matter the age. Really, we have still something to do in our own communities. It's not gone. It's not dead. We still have something that we can do as individuals to change that trajectory.
Absolutely. Any other questions about allyship? Dr. Hemmings? Wait for the mic, Doc, because I'm sure it's going to be brilliant.
Well, I have two observations here. Perhaps we can begin to address perhaps or speak perhaps in our intentions in congregation. Well, first, often in our conversations about race, one gets the impression that there are only two races existing in America. And perhaps we need to kind of adjust that. The second is that I noticed with great distress, this rift developing between Black males and Black females in America. What is going on here? What do we do as a church? Why are our Black males and our Black females turning against each other? What is happening? I need to know what is happening and what can the local church congregation do about it. That is a whole other issue that perhaps you need to get.
Thank you so much for bringing both of those things up, Dr. Hemmings. I'll address it like this. I completely agree. Race in America exists on a spectrum. And so when we talk about Black and white, we need to be intentional about talking about brown, because there are a variety of individuals in the middle who cannot be put into one of those two categories, yet they are racialized and having racialized experiences in the country. Thank you, Dr. Sheikh. Second question about what seems to be a growing rift between Black women and Black men. I've been seeing it as well, particularly on social media. And I think that we really don't understand how powerful social media is. And it is driving a serious, and I mean serious, wedge between these two individuals. And it particularly has to do with relationships. Now, I'm not a marriage and family person. I'm not married, so I'm not going to pretend to get up here and wax eloquent about relationships. However, right now, Black women are the most educated demographic in the country. And with that education is also coming an no, don't clap. With that is coming an unwillingness to submit. Submit to men. Just mutual submission.
Yeah.
Basic mutual.
Be very careful there.
But I think it's very important for us to also recognize that there is a level of disrespect that a lot of Black women are exerting on Black men, and that is causing a serious rift. So I get the importance of talking about mutual submission for sure. But if we want to address the rift that's happening, the rift that is between Black men and Black women is not exclusively because Black men are constantly trying to hold Black women down. That is one narrative that we are constantly putting out there, constantly seeking to address. And I think that that is very real and it should be tackled. But at the same time as tackling the Black men that are keeping Black women down, we have to address the Black women that are in a constant state of disrespecting Black men.
Can I say, I think then we need to address the toxic patriarchal system that is causing this.
Mm-hmm.
Because women who themselves are super educated, they are still of the impression that the man has to be somewhere above them, has to have a better education or the same as them, has to earn more money or the same as them.
Right.
That is due to a patriarchal mindset.
Yeah.
And therefore, that is what we need to uproot and undo.
Mm-hmm.
It shows how men are as much victims of patriarchy as
Absolutely.
women are victims of patriarchy.
Absolutely.
Women need to get into their mentality. If you earn a lot of money, there's nothing wrong with your man who perhaps is having a problem with a job that he can take care of the children. If the man is that living. That's what I'm trying to say here. We have to undo those biases, those patriarchal mindsets.
Yeah.
Really makes relationships not only among Black men and Black women, but men and women very toxic and very volatile.
Absolutely. Totally appreciate that, Dr. Hemmings, and I completely agree with everything that you shared. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about allyship. If we want to do allyship in our communities, if we want to do allyship in our churches, we must at some level be willing to do allyship in the home, right? And we've got to be willing to create allies with one another across cultures, across genders, across races. So thank you all so much for your time, and I'm definitely looking forward to our next plenary session.